It's hard to imagine that the Great Halls of Moria were once a few caves that were scattered in the misty mountains, before the dwarfs came across them and decided to build a great kingdom within these mountains. The first dwarf to find them was called Durin, the father of the Longbeard clan, and he became the king of Khazad-Dum, the greatest of the dwarven mansions. Hey guys, it's Carl here, and in today's episode, we'll be exploring the story of Durin, the founder of Moria. So the dwarfs have quite an interesting origin story, because they were created by Aule, the smith of the Valar. He wanted to create his own creatures that he could teach and share his knowledge with, though these dwarfs weren't truly alive, and they were more like puppets that would only act and talk whenever Aule's attention was focused on them. Durin was one of the 7 dwarven fathers, the oldest one in fact, and he was the first dwarf to be created. And these dwarfs were eventually given the gift of life through the intervention of LOTR, the one true god of Ea. Now even though LOTR gave the dwarfs the gift of life, he didn't want them to establish themselves in Middle-Earth before the elves awakened, and so he commanded Aule to put them to sleep and to bury them throughout the lands of Middle-Earth. When the time was right, LOTR would awaken the dwarfs from the sleep, and each of the 7 dwarven fathers was buried with a female partner, apart from Durin, who was buried alone. His burial place was beneath Mount Gundabad in the Misty Mountains, and this is why this place would become such a sacred location for the dwarfs of his line. Now when Durin awoke, he was fascinated by everything that surrounded him, and he traveled southwards, naming the various hills and valleys that he came across. He eventually reached a lake called the Mirmir, and as he looked inside it, he saw 7 stars reflected in its surface, in the shape of a crown upon his head, and he took this to be a sign, and he started to build a home in the nearby caverns that were found above this lake. Now of course, he couldn't build the kingdom of Khazad-Dum alone, and he was eventually joined by other dwarfs who helped him to carve out these mansions. According to Tolkien, these dwarfs were from other clans that had migrated from the western and eastern lands, though it seems that he wasn't too happy with this explanation, because in a later note, Tolkien suggested that he should change the dwarf story to explain their increase in population. This new idea was that Aule had also buried some other dwarfs close to the fathers of their clan, which would explain how they were able to grow as a society. Now these dwarfs would manage to carve out the greatest of the dwarven kingdoms, Khazad-Dum, and Durin became their king. Under his rule, they were incredibly successful and rich, especially thanks to the mithril that they found within these mountains, though they were still far off from the peak of their success, which would take place in the Third Age. Even so, it's likely that some of Khazad-Dum's greatest structures, such as Durin's Tower or the Endless Stair, were built during his reign, assuming of course that they were named after him and not one of his successors. Now at first the dwarfs must have thought that Durin was immortal because he lived for over 2,300 years, which was almost 10 times more than the average dwarf lifespan. This is why he was called Durin the Deathless, though his time would eventually come, and he passed away towards the end of the First Age, and the dwarfs buried him in a tomb in Moria. You might think that this was the end of the story of Durin, though the dwarfs had an interesting belief when it came to their king. For according to dwarven lore, when one of the 7 fathers of the dwarfs died, such as Durin, his spirit would remain in his tomb, where it was healed from all its hurts and weariness, and after many long years, it would re-enter a new dwarven king, who would also be named Durin. They believed that this cycle of rebirth would take place 6 times, and it seems that these kings would also be quite long-lived compared to the other dwarfs. They would also be very similar to Durin the First, and the dwarfs claimed that with each reincarnation, Durin would retain all of the memories of his past lives, and they would seem as if they were one consecutive lifespan. Now out of all of the 7 kings of Moria called Durin, there are 4 others that really stand out. The first one was Durin III, who was the king of Khazad-Dum when the Rings of Power were forged. During his reign, the dwarfs had a very strong friendship with the elves of Eregion, and he was given one of the 7 dwarven rings of power. Because of this friendship, the dwarfs built the west gate of Moria so that they could trade easily with these elves, and the emblem of Durin, which was an anvil and a hammer surrounded by a crown with 7 stars, was carved upon this door. The next Durin was Durin IV, who was the king of the Dwarves of Moria at the height of Sauron's power, and he led his forces and took part in the Battle of the Last Alliance. In my opinion, the most famous Durin apart from Durin the Deathless was probably Durin VI. For during his reign, Moria had reached the height of its power and wealth. Though as they searched for mithril in these mountains, the dwarfs would end up uncovering and awakening the Balrog, and this demon would end up killing Durin and his son. We don't know exactly when Durin VII, who was said to be the last of Durin's reincarnations, was born, though his birth was prophesied after the dwarfs fought against the goblins in the Battle of the Five Armies. They believed that one day, a descendant of Day 9-foot would be born, and he would be the last Durin to appear in the line of kings, and he would lead the dwarfs once more to reclaim their kingdom of Moria, and they would fill it with light and music. It is said that the line of Durin would never fail, and it would live on forever. And I would also like to point out that the name Durin was a simple word for king in the language of men, and so we actually don't know what his real dwarven name was, since they were a very secretive people and they didn't reveal their names to other races. It's possible that some of Durin's possessions could still be found in Moria, for after Balin led an expedition to recolonize Moria in the year 2989 of the Third Age, we know that they managed to come across Durins Axe, and it was clearly a precious relic for the dwarfs. Now I am a bit skeptical that this axe belonged to Durin the Deathless, since I imagine that it would probably have been buried beside him in his tomb, and I don't see the dwarfs disturbing his rest, and so I feel that it's much more likely that they came across the axe of Durin VI, who was killed by the Balrog. This makes much more sense to me, for it does seem possible that Durin VI had his axe in his possession when he was slain, and that the dwarfs would come across this relic after all those hundreds of years. There is one more thing that I'd like to point out, and it's about the Mirmir, the lake where Durin first saw a crown of stars reflected in its water. So this area bore a lot of significance to the dwarfs, and in fact they marked its location with a single column called Durin's Stone. What's interesting is that if someone looked into the water, even during the daytime, they would see the crown of stars reflected in its surface, even though there wouldn't be any stars above them, since again it was during the day. It makes it almost seem magical in nature, a reflection of how Durin was meant to lead his people as their king, and start the greatest dwarven colony of Khazad-Dum. Anyway friends, this wraps up today's video, and I hope you enjoyed it. How do you guys feel about Durin the Deathless? Do you think that he was destined to be the king of Moria? And do you believe that he was reincarnated to lead his people once more? As always, I'd really like to thank my patrons. You guys really helped to make this channel possible, and I deeply appreciate your support. Especially my Wizard-Tier Patrons: Jacob Williams, Michelangelo, T-Gorman, James Tugel, Andrew Bomer, Mike Feeney, Roland Myrvold, Jeremy Pontier, and Big Boy. If you too would like to help and support this channel while unlocking some cool perks, I'll be leaving a link to my Patreon page in the video description. You can also support this channel by checking out our store and by following us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, and joining our Discord server. You can find all of these links in the video description. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to join our fellowship today. I hope to see you all in my next video, where together we'll once again explore the magical world and lore of Middle-Earth.